The word struck her like a slap, even though they weren't aimed at her directly. Clara Johnson had just bent down to pick up a stack of papers that had fallen near the door of the physics conference room when she heard it. A sharp, mocking laugh, followed by a man's voice dripping with condescension. "You're just a black maid, stay in your place." Clara froze. For a moment, she thought they might be talking about her, but she realized the insult was thrown at a junior assistant in the room, a young intern who had dared to suggest an idea during a heated discussion. The sting of those words, however, landed squarely on Clara's heart. She had heard variations of the same sentiment her entire life, words meant to cage her, to remind her where others believed she belonged. The corridor smelled faintly of chalk and disinfectant. The sterile hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence after the laughter subsided. Clara pressed the papers to her chest and hurried away, her head lowered, but her mind ablaze. Behind the door, the men returned to their equations, debating constants and variables, never knowing that the woman sweeping the floors outside could see the elegance in those numbers as clearly as they could. Before we continue, let me pause to invite you. If stories of resilience, triumph, and unexpected brilliance move you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss the journeys we share, stories that remind us that greatness can come from anywhere. Clara Johnson was 28 years old, tall, with steady eyes and a quiet presence that made her seem invisible in rooms where invisibility was convenient for others. She worked as a cleaner at the prestigious Boston Research Institute, a building that housed some of the most brilliant scientific minds in the country. Every evening, while professors and postdocs argued theories under glowing lecture hall lamps, Clara pushed her cart down echoing hallways, emptying trash bins, polishing glass doors, and mopping tiled floors. Yet inside her heart, another life beat, a secret one. Clara loved mathematics with a passion that had never dimmed, not since she was a girl sitting in the back row of her elementary school classroom in Atlanta, solving problems faster than the teacher could write them on the board. Life had forced her away from that path, into jobs that paid the bills but did not feed her mind. Still, whenever she saw an equation left on a chalkboard or a scribbled formula in the margin of discarded notes, her eyes lingered, hungry. That night, after her shift, Clara returned to her small rented room on the edge of Roxbury. The autumn air outside carried a bite, and she hugged her jacket tighter as she climbed the stairs. Inside, the space was cramped but clean. On her nightstand sat her most precious possession, a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with symbols, equations, and half-finished ideas. She opened it with the same reverence others might show for scripture. Her pen hovered above the page as her mind replayed the insult from earlier. "You're just a black maid." The words ached, but beneath the ache stirred something stronger, a quiet defiance. She began writing, filling the page with numbers, chasing the trail of an equation she had glimpsed on the chalkboard in that conference room. Her handwriting was neat, her reasoning precise, her eyes sharp with focus. She wasn't solving it yet, far from it. But as the numbers lined up, as her thoughts stretched beyond the borders of her tired day, Clara felt alive. For her, math wasn't just numbers. It was order in chaos. It was truth that no insult could erase. Tomorrow, she would push her cart again through those cold, echoing halls. Tomorrow she would nod politely when ignored, smile when dismissed. But tonight she let the equations remind her of what she knew deep down, that brilliance was not confined to job titles or uniforms. And as her pen raced across the page, Clara whispered to herself, steady and certain, "I am more than what they see." The night deepened, the city outside settling into quiet, and Clara kept writing, unaware that the path she had begun to walk would lead her into a battle not just against numbers but against prejudice itself. A battle that would test every ounce of her strength and reveal the power of a mind no one had expected. The Boston Research Institute glittered like a temple of knowledge, its glass walls reflecting the autumn sun as if brilliance itself lived inside. To the outside world, it was a sanctuary where minds wrestled with the mysteries of the universe. For Clara Johnson, it was a place of contradictions, a building she scrubbed and polished until it gleamed, yet one where she walked unseen, a shadow moving between professors who never learned her name. Her mornings began before dawn. She tied her hair back, slipped into her faded uniform, and caught the bus that rattled across neighborhoods divided by wealth and race. On one side, brownstones with cracked steps and grocery stores with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. On the other, manicured lawns and bakeries that sold croissants at prices higher than Clara's hourly wage. Each ride reminded her of the distance she carried, not just in miles but in opportunity. At work, the rhythm was predictable. Emptying wastebaskets that overflowed with half-eaten sandwiches and crumpled research drafts. Wiping fingerprints from glass doors that opened only for ID badges she would never have. The scent of ammonia clung to her hands long after her shift ended. Still, Clara kept her posture tall, her movements precise. If she had to clean the Institute's halls, she would do it with quiet dignity. In those corridors, she occasionally passed Dr. Richard Hale. He was one of the few scientists who offered her a nod, sometimes even a polite, "Good evening, Miss Johnson." He had kind but distracted eyes, as if always halfway lost in an equation. Clara respected him, though she knew respect did not mean recognition. Outside of work, Clara's world narrowed to a small apartment and the church down the street. The church was her anchor. On Sundays, gospel voices lifted the walls until it felt like heaven might lean down and listen. That was where she met Evelyn Walker, a middle-aged choir singer with a laugh that filled every corner of a room. Evelyn often clasped Clara's hand after service, saying, "Child, don't you ever let this world tell you what you're worth. You're worth more than gold." Clara would smile, but inside she wrestled with the truth. She knew her mind was sharp. Numbers came to her naturally, flowing into patterns she could see as clearly as the notes in a hymn. But she also knew the weight of reality. She hadn't been able to finish college. Bills piled up after her father left and her mother fell sick. Working jobs had become survival, and survival had pushed her dreams into the background. Still, the hunger for learning never left. Every week she visited a dusty second-hand bookstore near Dudley Square. The owner, an elderly man with spectacles slipping down his nose, always set aside old math and physics books for her. "Don't know what you see in these, but I can tell you do," he once said, handing her a tattered volume of linear algebra. Clara thanked him with the same quiet gratitude she carried everywhere, yet no matter how much she studied, the Institute reminded her of her supposed place. Professors walked past her carrying briefcases heavy with prestige. Graduate students discussed research while sipping lattes in the lobby, their words drifting into Clara's ears like another language. They never imagined the maid polishing the brass railings was silently following their discussions, storing them away like puzzle pieces for later. One evening, as she wheeled her cart past a chalkboard filled with dense equations, Clara paused. She stared at the symbols, her mind spinning faster than her broom. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to dream. What if she could stand in front of that board, chalk in hand, her ideas taken seriously? But then footsteps echoed down the hall, and she quickly resumed wiping the floor. Clara's world was one of contrasts, brilliance and invisibility, intellect and anonymity. She lived in the margins of a place that celebrated genius, yet she carried genius within her. What she didn't know was that her quiet pursuit of knowledge, done in the shadows of others' greatness, was preparing her for a moment when silence would no longer be possible. The Boston Research Institute carried an air of urgency that autumn. Meetings stretched late into the night, lights burning in conference rooms long after the janitorial staff had arrived. Whispers drifted down corridors, deadlines, funding, government contracts. For Clara Johnson, these murmurs were background noise as she emptied trash bins and dusted desks. But that night, the noise sharpened into something different, a tension heavy enough to linger in the air. Inside one of the glass-walled conference rooms, a group of scientists argued around a chalkboard covered in symbols. Clara, moving quietly with her cart, caught fragments of their voices. "This doesn't align with the projection models," one said, slamming a folder shut. "You're missing the correction term again," another snapped. Dr. Richard Hale, seated at the far end, rubbed his temples. His voice, usually calm, was tight with frustration. "We've been circling the same variable for weeks. If we can't present progress by the end of the quarter, the grant is gone." Clara slowed her pace, though she kept her eyes on the floor. She never intended to eavesdrop, but the words pulled her in. Grant, deadline, progress. The rhythm of desperation echoed louder than the squeak of her mop. Later, as the scientists left for a break, the chalkboard remained littered with equations like a battlefield after the clash. Clara stood alone, staring. Numbers marched across the surface. Dense matrices, strange operators, complex integrations. They should have intimidated her, but instead they called to her. She recognized fragments, pieces she had taught herself in nights spent hunched over her notebook. It was not all familiar, but enough for her to trace the outline of what they were struggling with. A feeling stirred inside her chest, part awe, part hunger. She whispered under her breath, "It's beautiful." The door swung open, startling her. Dr. Hale re-entered, carrying a stack of files. He barely glanced at her, his focus still on the looming board. Clara lowered her gaze quickly and returned to her cart, pushing it toward the hallway. But even as she moved away, the image of those numbers burned in her mind. The Institute's problem wasn't just academic. Funding was tied to breakthroughs, and breakthroughs meant prestige. Boston's scientific circles buzzed with competition, MIT, Harvard, private labs, all racing to crack theories of the universe. The particular equation haunting the Institute revolved around astrophysics, a model meant to explain certain gravitational anomalies observed in deep space. It was cutting-edge work, the kind newspapers called the frontier of human knowledge. Yet here, in these halls, it was a source of sleepless nights and strained tempers. For Clara, who lived at the edge of invisibility, the irony was sharp. The very equations that consumed brilliant minds by day were the ones she secretly dreamed of by night. Equations that erased the weight of labels like Maid or unqualified. Numbers were pure. They belonged to no race, no gender, no social class. As she finished her shift and stepped into the crisp night air, Clara felt the cool wind sting her cheeks. The city lights glimmered in the distance, but her thoughts remained fixed on that chalkboard. She replayed the fragments she had memorized, trying to hold on to them before sleep, and routine stole them away. That night, in her cramped apartment, Clara opened her worn notebook again. She tried sketching the outline of the problem, her pencil scratching furiously across the page. Some steps made sense, others slipped through her grasp like water. Still, she pressed on, driven by the echo of Hale's words. "We've been circling the same variable for weeks." It wasn't her place to solve their problem. She knew that. But the fire in her chest told her it was her place to try. What Clara could not yet see was that the Institute's unsolved equation, a source of frustration for the scientists, would become her silent battleground. It was here, in the tension between brilliance and dismissal, that her journey was about to shift. Clara's fascination with numbers didn't begin in Boston. It stretched back to Atlanta, to a childhood filled with challenges that might have crushed another spirit, but instead sharpened hers. She could still picture her mother's modest kitchen, the peeling wallpaper with faded yellow flowers, and the way the late afternoon light streamed through the small window as she worked on her math homework at the table. While other children groaned at fractions, Clara's eyes lit up. Numbers were puzzles, and puzzles always had answers if you looked hard enough. Her teachers noticed. By the age of 10, Clara could solve problems meant for high school students. "This girl's got a gift," one teacher whispered to her mother. Her mother, exhausted from double shifts at a diner, only smiled and said, "I already knew that. My Clara sees the world different." But life didn't bend to brilliance. Her father left when she was 12, disappearing with no explanation except the echo of slammed doors. Bills piled high and her mother's health weakened. Clara stepped in, taking part-time jobs while still in school. Every dollar she earned helped keep the lights on, but every shift she worked chipped away at her dream of higher education. By the time she graduated high school, scholarships weren't enough to cover tuition and home expenses together. Clara chose family, shelving her ambition to study mathematics so her mother wouldn't lose their house. When her mother passed years later, Clara clung to her final words like a lifeline. Lying weak but steady-eyed in her hospital bed, She had reached for Clara's hand and whispered, "Numbers don't lie, baby. They'll always make sense, even when people don't." Those words lived inside Clara, guiding her through the silence of nights when grief threatened to consume her. Now in her Boston apartment, that memory kept her moving. She worked her janitorial shifts with discipline, but her true life began when she returned home, shed her uniform, and opened her notebook. Each page was filled with problems she copied from library books, journal articles she barely afforded, and lecture notes she sometimes glimpsed abandoned in institute hallways. She had built a ritual. After making a modest dinner, usually beans and rice or whatever was cheapest at the corner store, she would clear her tiny table and spread out her books. The sounds of the neighborhood filtered through the thin walls. Children laughing, sirens in the distance, the bass of a car stereo thumping down the street. Clara tuned it all out. Her pencil scratched furiously as she chased equations across the page. Some nights exhaustion pressed down so heavily her eyes blurred. She would rest her head for just a moment, only to wake an hour later with her cheek on the notebook. Still, she pushed forward. Each solved problem felt like reclaiming a piece of the life she had once dreamed of. There were evenings when Evelyn, her church friend, would stop by with cornbread or sweet tea. She'd glance at the spread of papers and shake her head. "Girl, you're going to wear that pencil out before you wear yourself out." Clara would laugh softly. "I can't help it. This is the only place where the world makes sense." Evelyn would smile knowingly. "Then keep at it. God gave you a gift for a reason." The gift felt like both a blessing and a burden. Clara carried it quietly, aware the world around her didn't want to see brilliance wrapped in the uniform of a maid. But still she studied. Still she scribbled, erased and scribbled again, page after page. And when she looked up from her notebook in the stillness of the night, Clara knew one truth. The world might underestimate her, but the numbers never did. That fire inside her was growing, preparing her for the moment when she would no longer be able to hide it. The institute buzzed with unusual activity that week. The equation that haunted its brightest minds grew heavier with each passing day, its unsolved nature pressing like a storm cloud above every discussion. For Clara Johnson, who moved through the hallways with her mop and cart, the tension was almost tangible. Conversations cut off when she entered, but equations left on chalkboards told her the story anyway. She carried their frustrations silently, like echoes inside her own mind. One late evening, after most scientists had left, Clara found herself alone in the corridor outside the main conference room. The air was thick with chalk dust, and the board inside was covered with sprawling calculations. Her eyes followed the trail of symbols, tracing the logic like stepping stones across a river. Then suddenly she saw it, a small miscalculation barely noticeable, a misplaced sign that shifted the entire progression. Her heart pounded. She hesitated, gripping the handle of her mop so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Should she? The thought of stepping closer terrified her. She was a maid, not a scholar, but the numbers called to her, louder than the fear. Carefully, as if trespassing into forbidden land, Clara set down her mop and reached for the chalk. Her hand trembled, but she corrected the sign, rewriting the expression so the logic flowed again. When she stepped back, the board seemed clearer, the path of the equation smoother. For a fleeting moment, pride filled her chest. She whispered to herself, "That's better." The sound of footsteps jolted her. 3 scientists returned, their voices carrying laughter mixed with frustration. Clara froze, chalk still in her hand. She turned quickly, hoping to slip away, but one of them noticed. "What are you doing?" His tone was sharp, incredulous. Clara stammered, I just noticed there might have been a small mistake, sir." The room erupted in laughter. Another voice, dripping with disdain, added, "You're just a black maid. Leave the math to the people who belong here." The words hit Clara like ice water. Her throat tightened and heat rose to her cheeks. She placed the chalk back in the tray carefully, almost reverently, and whispered, "Yes, sir." Her hands shook as she grabbed her mop and cart. Behind her the laughter lingered, cruel and careless. She pushed her cart down the hall, her eyes stinging. She didn't cry, not here, not where they might see, but inside the humiliation burned. It wasn't just the insult, it was the dismissal, the assumption that her mind couldn't possibly belong in the same world as theirs. When she reached the janitor's closet, Clara leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. She forced her breathing to steady. Evelyn's words came back to her, "Don't let this world tell you what you're worth," and her mother's, "Numbers don't lie, baby." Slowly she straightened her shoulders. The sting of the insult was real, but beneath it pulsed a stronger truth. She had seen the error, she had been right. The scientists could laugh, they could dismiss her. But numbers didn't laugh, and they didn't dismiss. Numbers spoke with clarity, and they had spoken to her. As she walked out into the cool night air after her shift, Clara's humiliation transformed into a quiet resolve. She whispered under her breath, "One day, I'll prove them wrong." The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk as she made her way home. Inside her, the fire that had always burned for mathematics grew hotter, fueled not only by love for the subject, but now by defiance. The insult had cut her, but it also gave her something sharper, the certainty that she could not remain invisible forever. That night, she filled page after page in her notebook, determination pressing her pencil hard against the paper. The laughter still echoed in her ears, but she was already transforming it into fuel. The following evening, Clara walked the halls of the Institute with her usual cart, her head held a little lower than usual. The sting of the insult still lingered, echoing in her ears every time she thought of the chalk in her hand. She told herself to forget it, to push the moment deep into memory and focus on her work. But forgetting was impossible. The numbers stayed with her, as if carved into her skin. She was emptying a bin near the physics department office when a quiet voice startled her. "Miss Johnson?" She turned to see Dr. Richard Hale standing in the doorway. His posture was thoughtful, his greying hair slightly disheveled, his glasses slipping down his nose. Clara straightened quickly, clutching the trash bag. "Yes, sir?" she said softly. "I wanted to ask—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "That correction you made last night, did you notice it on your own?" Clara's heart thumped. She swallowed, unsure if it was a trap. Yes, sir. It just seemed like the sign was wrong. I didn't mean to overstep." Hale studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing, not in anger but in curiosity. "You were right. The error was small but important. Most people wouldn't have caught it." Clara felt her cheeks warm. "I've studied a little on my own. Just in my free time." Hale stepped closer, lowering his voice further so no one passing would overhear. "Where did you study mathematics formally?" "I didn't," Clara admitted. "I couldn't afford to finish college. But I've kept learning. Books, articles, whatever I can get my hands on." Her honesty hung between them. Hale tapped his chin, conflicted. "You realize people here won't take kindly to you participating?" Clara nodded quickly. "I know, I don't want trouble, Dr. Hale. I love numbers. They make sense to me in a way nothing else does." For the first time she saw a flicker of respect in his expression. Loving numbers isn't enough in this field. Credentials matter. Proof matters. "I understand," Clara said. She tightened her grip on the trash bag, ready to retreat. But Hale stopped her with a quiet remark. Still, very few people would have spotted that correction. "Don't sell yourself short." Those words, simple as they were, felt like a hand reaching out of the darkness. Clara nodded, unable to hide the small spark of pride that rose inside her. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Hale adjusted his glasses and stepped back into his office. "Be careful, Miss Johnson. The world isn't always kind to people who step out of line." Clara carried on with her shift, but her thoughts buzzed with new energy. For the first time, someone inside the Institute had acknowledged her ability, even if cautiously. It wasn't full acceptance, not even close, but it was enough to fan the fire she carried. That night, in her apartment, she wrote the words in her notebook. "Don't sell yourself short." She circled them twice, underlining them like a promise. The next day, She noticed Hale glance at her as she passed in the hall. He didn't speak, but there was a quiet recognition in his nod. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It wasn't equality either. But it was something Clara had never received within those walls, validation that her mind mattered. As she polished the brass railings, her reflection looked back at her in the gleam. She whispered to herself, "If the math is right, it speaks louder than my uniform." She straightened her shoulders, ready for whatever came next, unaware that this fragile acknowledgement was the first step toward a bond that would test them both. 2 nights later, Clara lingered longer than usual after her shift. She told herself it was to finish polishing the stairwell railing, but the truth was different. She was waiting for Dr. Hale. Something inside her urged her to take a step she had never dared before. When the hallway finally emptied, Hale emerged from his office carrying a folder of papers under his arm. He paused when he saw Clara. "Still working this late?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she replied, though her voice trembled with the weight of what she was about to do. She hesitated, then drew a deep breath. "Dr. Hale, may I show you something?" Hale frowned slightly, curious. "What is it?" Clara reached into her cleaning cart, where beneath a folded towel she had hidden her most precious possession. She pulled out the worn leather notebook and held it close to her chest for a moment, as if reluctant to let it go. Then, with both hands, she extended it toward him. "This is mine," she said softly. It's where I keep my work." Hale looked surprised, but he took the notebook carefully as though it might fall apart in his hands. He flipped open the first pages, his brow furrowing. Lines of equations filled the sheets, neatly written, dense with thought. He turned page after page, linear algebra proofs, calculus problems, differential equations. Some were textbook exercises, but others bore her own handwritten notes, corrections, and even original methods. Clara stood silently, twisting her fingers together, her stomach knotted. This was her soul laid bare. Finally, Hale stopped on a page scrawled with variations of the Institute's problem. He traced the lines with his finger, his expression unreadable. "You've been working on this?" he asked, glancing up. "Yes," Clara admitted. "I don't know everything, but I can't help it. I see the numbers and I have to try." Hale closed the notebook slowly. His voice was low, almost conflicted. "Miss Johnson, do you realize what this means? If anyone else sees this—" "I know," Clara interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear in her chest. "They'll laugh. They'll dismiss me. They'll remind me of what I am to them." "But if the math is right, Dr. Hale, doesn't that matter more than who wrote it?" Hale studied her with a long, searching gaze. The silence stretched between them until Clara feared she had overstepped too far. At last he sighed. "Your work. It's more than hobbyist scribbling. You understand concepts that some graduate students struggle with." Clara felt her heart leap, though she kept her eyes lowered. "Thank you, sir." "But," Hale added quickly, "the academic world is brutal. They won't take you seriously without credentials. They won't want to believe this notebook belongs to you." Clara lifted her chin, her voice steady. "That doesn't change the truth on those pages." For the first time, Hale smiled faintly, though it was tinged with worry. "You're braver than most of my colleagues." "Perhaps too brave." He handed the notebook back and Clara held it to her chest like a shield. In that moment, she felt both exposed and validated. Someone had seen her. Not just the uniform, not just the role, but the mind beneath. As Hale walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, Clara stood frozen, her notebook clutched tightly. She whispered to herself, "One day the math will speak for me." That night she opened the notebook again at her kitchen table, her pencil poised. Every number she wrote now carried a new weight. She was no longer invisible. She had been seen, and though the world outside still doubted her, inside her chest burned a growing certainty. The equations themselves would one day demand recognition. The next day Dr. Hale lingered after a departmental meeting, his mind unsettled. Clara's notebook weighed on his thoughts like an unanswered question. He had seen determination before, bright students eager to prove themselves, but Clara's work carried something different. It was raw talent shaped by hunger, a mind that refused to be silenced. Still, the risk of acknowledging it openly was enormous. His colleagues would mock him, perhaps even question his credibility. That evening he found Clara wiping down a row of desks in an empty lecture hall. She looked up, startled, when he entered. "Miss Johnson," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've been thinking about your notebook." Clara froze, unsure whether this would bring reprimand or something else. "Yes, sir." Hale set a folder on the desk. "These are partial data sets from our project. Nothing confidential, but enough to test your abilities. I want to see what you can do." Clara blinked, her heart racing. "You mean you want me to work on them?" "I want you to try," Hale said firmly, "but you must understand this stays between us. If anyone asks, you never saw these papers." Clara hesitated only for a moment before nodding. "I'll do my best." That night, at her small kitchen table, Clara spread out the data sheets. The numbers swam before her eyes at first, dense and intimidating. She rubbed her temples, whispering, "All right, let's see what you're hiding." Hours passed. She scribbled calculations, erased, started again. Midnight came and went. Fatigue gnawed at her, but clarity struck in flashes, illuminating patterns others had overlooked. She began to see a missing link, a subtle relationship between two variables the scientists had treated as separate. Her pulse quickened as she traced the thread, her pencil moving faster across the paper. By dawn, her table was a battlefield of notes, but in the center lay a neat page of equations, leading to an insight that tied the pieces together. Clara leaned back, exhausted but exhilarated. She whispered, "This is it. This is the step they've been missing." When she handed the pages to Hale the following evening, her hands trembled. "I don't know if it's right, but this is what I found." Hale scanned the calculations, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. He muttered to himself, testing her reasoning in his head. At last, he lowered the papers slowly. "You realize the correlation between the constants," he said almost to himself. "We dismissed it because it looked insignificant." Clara bit her lip. "But it shifts the outcome, doesn't it?" "Yes," Hale admitted. His voice carried both awe and unease. "It does." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Clara stood with her hands clasped tightly, afraid to breathe. Finally, Hale looked at her with something that resembled both admiration and caution. "You understand what this means? You've seen what our team of PhDs has overlooked. But if I bring this forward and reveal you as the source," he shook his head, "they won't accept it. They'll reject the idea outright." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart hammered. "Then don't tell them it was me. Just test it. If it's wrong, no harm done. If it's right, then the math speaks for itself." Hale's lips pressed into a thin line. He could not deny the strength of her reasoning, but the moral weight of secrecy pressed on him. He studied her, seeing not just the maid everyone dismissed, but the relentless spark in her eyes. "You're forcing me to question more than numbers, Miss Johnson," he said quietly. Clara held his gaze. "I only want the truth to be seen. Nothing else." As Hale folded the papers and slipped them back into his folder, he knew the boundaries he had lived within were shifting. Clara had shown him that brilliance could not be caged by titles, but whether the world was ready to hear it was another question entirely. For a brief moment, Clara felt as if the world had cracked open. "Doctor." Hale had not only taken her work seriously, he had acknowledged its strength. Each evening after her shift, she handed him pages filled with calculations, and each time his silence grew heavier, his respect deeper. The collaboration was fragile, hidden in the shadows of a world that would never believe a maid could stand on equal footing with their scientists. But secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. One late afternoon, as Hale and Clara bent over her pages in his office, the door swung open. Dr. Milton Avery, a senior physicist with sharp features and a reputation for arrogance, strode inside without knocking. His eyes fell immediately on the spread of notes between them. "What's this?" Avery asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Hale stiffened. "Just reviewing some ideas." Avery snatched one of the pages before Hale could stop him. His eyes skimmed the equations, then flicked to Clara, standing silent by the desk, his lips curled into a sneer. "Don't tell me you're entertaining the maid's fantasies." Clara's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "They're not fantasies, sir." "The math works." Avery laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Good God, Richard, have you lost your mind? You're wasting time on a cleaning lady's doodles while the rest of us are fighting to save this project." Hale's jaw tightened. She saw a link we missed. Her reasoning is sound. "Sound?" Avery scoffed, tossing the paper back onto the desk. "Do you understand what you're risking? If word gets out that one of our senior researchers is being tutored by the janitorial staff, you'll be a laughingstock, and don't think the board will be forgiving." Clara stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides. The room felt smaller with Avery's disdain filling every corner. "I don't care about reputation," Hale shot back, his voice sharper now. "I care about the truth. If her work leads us forward, then it deserves attention." Avery turned his scorn on Clara again. "Listen to me. You may think you're clever, but this world doesn't want you here. If you're smart, you'll stay in your lane. Because if you don't—" He leaned closer, his voice dropping like poison. "You'll lose the little you have." The words cut deeper than the insult in the conference room. Clara's throat tightened, but she refused to drop her eyes. "I'm not afraid of the truth," she said quietly. Avery straightened, disgust etched across his face. "Hale, you're jeopardizing everything. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to bring it up with the board and with administration. Don't say you weren't warned." With that, he stormed out, the door slamming behind him. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Hale rubbed his forehead, his shoulders slumping. "This is exactly what I feared." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. Will he have me fired?" Hale hesitated. "It's possible. He's powerful here. And if he convinces others that this collaboration undermines the Institute's credibility—" His words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Clara hugged her notebook tightly to her chest, her pulse hammering. Fear mingled with defiance, a storm raging inside her. For so long, invisibility had been her shield. Now, exposure felt like both a threat and an inevitability. "Then, let him try," she said finally, her voice trembling but steady. "If the math is right, no one can erase it forever." Hale looked at her with weary admiration. "You're braver than I am, Miss Johnson. But bravery comes at a cost." Clara turned toward the window, the city lights beginning to flicker on against the evening sky. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not let fear silence her again. The storm Avery had promised arrived faster than Clara imagined. Within a week, whispers spread through the Institute. Scientists who had once ignored her now cast suspicious glances when she passed. Conversations cut off the moment she entered a room with her cart. Even the janitorial staff, usually warm companions, grew cautious, as if standing too close to Clara might taint their own security. The official notice came one Friday afternoon. The supervisor called Clara into his office, a cramped room with peeling paint and stacks of paperwork piled high. He avoided her eyes as he slid an envelope across the desk. "We've had complaints," he muttered. "Apparently, you've been interfering where you don't belong." Clara's throat tightened. "I was only cleaning, I never—" He raised a hand to cut her off. "Miss Johnson, I don't know what you've been doing, and I don't care to, but the board is clear they don't want you here anymore. Effective immediately." The words struck harder than any insult. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She clutched the envelope, unable to speak. The supervisor's tone softened slightly. "I'm sorry. You've been good at your work. But sometimes things are bigger than us." Clara walked out of the Institute that day carrying nothing but her notebook and her dignity, though both felt unbearably heavy. The autumn wind cut against her face as she stepped onto the street. The building loomed behind her, glass walls shining like a fortress she would never enter again. At home, despair closed in around her. She sat at her kitchen table staring at her notebook, but for the first time in years the numbers blurred. Her pencil hovered above the page, then fell limp from her hand. "What's the point?" she whispered. "They'll never let me be more than what they see. The walls of her apartment seemed to press closer, trapping her in silence. Tears came then, hot and unrelenting. She buried her face in her hands, letting years of frustration, humiliation, and exhaustion pour out. That Sunday she skipped church, but Evelyn showed up at her door anyway, a basket of food in her hands. She took one look at Clara's red eyes and said, "Child, tell me." Clara shook her head. "They fired me for daring to think I could be more." Evelyn set the basket down firmly and cupped Clara's face in her hands. "Listen to me. You are more. Don't let their blindness steal that from you." Clara's voice cracked. "But what good is my mind if no one will ever listen? If every door is slammed before I can even knock?" Evelyn sat across from her, her tone fierce. "Then you build your own door. You hear me? The Lord didn't put that fire in you just for you to let it burn out." Later that week, Hale called. Clara almost didn't answer, but his persistence broke through her despair. "Clara," he said gently, "I'm sorry. I should have protected you better." "It's done," she replied flatly. "No," Hale said firmly. "Your work is too important. What you found, it matters. Don't give up now." Clara stared at her notebook lying closed on the table. "Maybe the world doesn't want me to matter." Hale's voice softened. "Then we'll make it want to. But only if you don't stop." After the call ended, Clara sat in silence. The ache in her chest was deep, but beneath it, Evelyn's words and Hale's insistence struck like small sparks. She wasn't ready to believe them fully, but she wasn't ready to surrender either. She picked up her notebook again, running her fingers across its worn cover. The pages inside held her truth, even if the world refused it. For now, that would have to be enough. Days slipped into weeks, and Clara tried to convince herself that life would return to normal. She took cleaning jobs in private homes, scrubbing kitchens and vacuuming living rooms, where no one whispered about equations or deadlines. The work was steady, but it left her hollow. Each time she caught sight of her notebook on the nightstand, her chest ached with the weight of something unfinished. One evening, Evelyn found her sitting quietly in the back pew of the church, long after service had ended. The candles still flickered at the altar, casting soft shadows across the room. "You've been quiet, child," Evelyn said, sliding onto the bench beside her. Clara sighed. "I can't stop thinking about it. That equation, those numbers, it's like they won't leave me alone. But what can I do? They've already shut me out." Evelyn leaned closer, her eyes fierce with conviction. "Then don't wait for their permission. Tell the world yourself." The idea struck Clara like a thunderclap. She turned to Evelyn, startled. "Me? How? No one would ever publish something from a maid with no degree." Evelyn smiled knowingly. "The truth has a way of finding ears if you speak it loud enough." That night Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her heart pounded with the audacity of the thought. Could she submit her solution to a journal, under her own name? The very notion felt both terrifying and liberating. She imagined the laughter, the rejection, the possibility of being dismissed once again. But she also imagined the chance, slim as it was, that someone might read her work and see the truth. By morning, she had made her decision. She spent days organizing her notes into clear arguments. Every page she rewrote carried not just equations, but her determination. She pored over journal guidelines at the public library, learning how to format submissions. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman who noticed her frequent visits, asked once, "Are you working on a school project?" Clara smiled faintly. "Something like that." When she finally typed her paper on an old, borrowed typewriter, she hesitated before signing her name at the end. Clara Johnson. Her hands trembled, but her resolve held firm. She mailed the thick envelope to a respected scientific journal, the postage stamps pressed down with her thumb like a seal of defiance. Then came the waiting. Days passed, then weeks. Each time the mail arrived, Clara's chest tightened. Each unopened envelope felt like a question mark hanging over her future. In the meantime, she returned to her cleaning jobs, polishing brass fixtures and folding linens, all while carrying the secret that her heart now lived elsewhere, in the envelope traveling through the world. searching for recognition. One afternoon, as she dusted a bookshelf in a wealthy family's home, she overheard the radio in the next room. A commentator spoke excitedly about new developments in theoretical physics, about research shaping humanity's understanding of the universe. Clara paused, feather duster in hand, her throat tightening. Somewhere out there, her work could be part of that conversation, but the silence from the journal grew heavier with each day. Doubt crept in like a shadow. What if they had laughed and tossed it in the trash? What if Evelyn's faith and Hale's encouragement had been misplaced? What if the world never heard her voice? Then, on a grey Thursday afternoon, she found a letter waiting in her mailbox. The envelope bore the emblem of the journal she had submitted to. Clara's hands shook as she slid her finger under the flap. Her breath caught. The words on the page blurred at first, but one line leapt out, striking her like lightning. "We are pleased to inform you that your submission demonstrates significant originality and merit." Clara's knees gave out, and she sank onto the steps outside her building, the letter trembling in her hands. For the first time in weeks, tears filled her eyes, not of despair, but of something far brighter. Clara sat on her narrow bed, the journal's letter spread across her lap. She had read it so many times the words had etched themselves into her mind. Significant originality and merit, contribution to the field, accepted for publication. Each phrase carried a weight she could scarcely believe belonged to her. For years her brilliance had lived only in secret notebooks and midnight scribbles. Now it was about to enter the world. The weeks that followed were surreal. She continued her house-cleaning jobs, but her mind was elsewhere. Between dusting shelves and scrubbing sinks, she thought about the fact that scholars she had never met were reading her work. Her equations, her work, were circulating among people who spoke the language she had taught herself in isolation. One evening she sat at her kitchen table when the phone rang. She hesitated, then answered. A man's voice introduced himself as an editor from the journal. "Miss Johnson, I wanted to personally congratulate you. Your paper has already attracted interest from several researchers. Some have called it a breakthrough." Clara pressed the receiver tightly to her ear, her breath catching. "There's a breakthrough?" "Yes," the editor said warmly. "You've managed to simplify a framework others have wrestled with for years. Your insight is being described as Johnson's correction. You should be proud." When she hung up, Clara sat in silence, her hands trembling. She whispered her mother's words aloud, as if summoning her spirit. "Numbers don't lie, baby." Soon the evidence of her recognition began to grow. She visited the library and, with her heart pounding, found her own name in the journal's latest edition. Seeing Clara Johnson printed in crisp black ink nearly stole her breath. She ran her fingers over the letters, proof that her mind was no longer invisible. But news travelled fast. Within weeks, Clara overheard professors at the institute, her former workplace, whispering in disbelief. In the coffee shops near campus, her name surfaced in conversations she wasn't part of. A cleaning colleague stopped her in the street and said, "Clara, is it true?" "Folks are saying your name's in a science journal." Clara nodded softly, unable to hide her smile. "It's true." The colleague shook his head in wonder. "Well, I'll be damned. About time someone saw you for who you are." But recognition didn't come without resistance. At the institute, Dr. Avery fumed. In faculty meetings, he dismissed the discovery, calling it a statistical fluke. Others questioned whether Clara had truly written the paper herself. "Surely Hale must have ghostwritten it," one muttered. The institute's leadership released a statement denying involvement, unwilling to admit they had once mocked and fired the mind behind the solution. Yet the tide was turning. Scientists outside Boston cited her work in lectures, calling it a vital shift in understanding. A professor at Princeton praised her insight during a symposium, noting, "Whoever Clara Johnson is, her clarity deserves recognition." For Clara, these moments were dizzying. She was still the same woman who ironed shirts for wealthy families and scrubbed their kitchens until they gleamed. Yet when she opened her notebook at night, she felt less alone. The world was finally listening. One evening she called Hale. "They published it," she told him, her voice trembling with joy. "I know," he replied softly. "I've read it 3 times. Clara, the community is paying attention." She hesitated. "But the Institute denies me. They act like I don't exist." Hale sighed. "Institutions protect their pride, but truth doesn't need their permission. Your work is out there now. No one can erase it." Clara closed her eyes, her chest swelling with both relief and determination. For so long she had dreamed of being heard. Now she was. But this was only the beginning. The first door cracked open in a hallway of many still closed. Clara had always known that recognition, once achieved, would come with its own set of complications, but nothing prepared her for the wave of attention that followed the publication of her work. It came slowly at first, a mention in an academic paper here, a brief reference at a conference there. But soon, as her equations were cited more and more, the discussions about Johnson's correction became impossible to ignore. The first time she saw her work discussed on a public stage, it felt surreal. The symposium was being held at the University of Chicago, and Clara had been watching the live stream when her name was announced. A professor stood at the podium, reading aloud from her paper, explaining the breakthrough she had made in simplifying a long-standing astrophysical dilemma. The words sounded distant, as if spoken about someone else. It wasn't until the professor said, "Clara Johnson's work is a game-changer in our field," that Clara's heart skipped. Her pulse quickened as she realized that the world now saw her as a scholar, not a maid. But the backlash from the Institute was inevitable. Dr. Avery led the charge. He dismissed her findings in interviews, accusing her of oversimplifying the equation. "I don't know who's been feeding her these ideas," he scoffed to a news outlet, "but there's no way someone with no credentials could have come to such a conclusion on their own." Clara was no stranger to the sting of dismissal. Still, hearing Avery's words made her breath catch. She had expected resistance from some corners, but hearing it so openly, so publicly, felt like a fresh wound. She sat on her apartment floor that night, staring at the TV screen where Avery's face scowled from the news broadcast. Evelyn stopped by the next day, as she often did, bringing a dish of macaroni and cheese Clara couldn't quite bring herself to eat. She sat across from her, her gaze kind but firm. "Let them talk, Clara. What's important is the work you did. You showed the world who you are. And those people, they can't take that away." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Evelyn's words. "But they're making it sound like I'm a fraud. They're saying I don't belong in this field." "You belong because you've earned it. The numbers don't lie, baby. You've already proven that." Clara nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of strength return to her chest. It wasn't just the Institute that needed to come to terms with her existence. It was the whole scientific community, and she wasn't going to let their reluctance stop her now. A few days later, Dr. Hale called her. His voice was soft but urgent. "Clara, I think it's time you take the next step. You've been invited to speak at a panel on emerging voices in astrophysics." "It's a big deal." Clara's heart skipped. "A panel? Me?" "Yes," he replied with a note of pride. "They want you to explain your work in front of a real audience. It's time for the world to hear your voice, and I think you're ready." She hesitated. Her hands were still trembling from the weight of the accusations, and the thought of speaking in front of a room full of scientists, many of whom had dismissed her, terrified her. "Clara," Hale's voice broke through her nerves, "you're not just speaking to them. You're speaking to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. You're speaking for every person who's had to fight for their place in the world." The words landed in Clara's chest with unexpected force. Slowly, she stood up, the room around her spinning, but her mind clear. "I'll do it." That night, she began preparing. She worked through her notes, rehearsing her presentation until it felt natural. Every time doubt crept in, she forced herself to remember the truth. The math was right. The day of the panel, Clara stood in front of a room full of scholars, her nerves tight, but her heart steady. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As the moderator called her name, she walked to the podium. And for the first time in her life, Clara Johnson stood in front of a crowd, not as the maid, not as the invisible worker, but as the mind behind an equation that was changing the way people saw the universe. The day of Clara's presentation arrived with a quiet finality. She stood in front of a crowd of scientists at the conference, feeling both the weight of their gazes and the fire in her chest. As the moderator introduced her, Clara stepped up to the podium, her hands shaking but her resolve unbroken. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The room was hushed, and she took a deep breath, grounding herself in the familiar comfort of the numbers. "My name is Clara Johnson. I am here to present an equation that was once dismissed, but which I believe can offer a new perspective on astrophysical anomalies." For a brief moment, she felt the weight of their skepticism pressing against her like an invisible force, but she pushed it aside. She was here because her work was valid, because it mattered. She began to speak, carefully, passionately explaining the breakthrough she had discovered in the chaotic world of theoretical physics. The numbers, the variables, the connections. She laid them out with precision, using the language she had taught herself in the stillness of nights filled with textbooks and determination. As she spoke, she saw the faces in the crowd change. The initial skepticism melted away, replaced by curiosity. One by one, researchers began to lean forward, scribbling notes, asking questions. Clara's heart swelled as she realized that she wasn't just talking to them, she was proving herself, not with words alone, but with the undeniable truth of her work. By the time she finished, there was a long moment of silence. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she waited for the response. Had she done enough? Had the breakthrough been clear enough? Finally, a professor from the front row raised his hand. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice measured but respectful, "your work challenges several long-held assumptions in our field. I've been following the developments, and I must say, this is compelling. I think we should explore this further." Clara's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and triumph. The applause began slowly, but it grew, and the room erupted in appreciation. For the first time in her life, Clara felt like the world saw her, truly saw her as she was. After the presentation, a small group of scientists gathered around her. They asked questions, offered their congratulations, and most importantly, acknowledged her. No one mentioned her background, her uniform, or her humble beginnings. They spoke to her as a peer, a colleague, a scholar in her own right. Later that evening, Dr. Hale came to find her. His expression was a mix of pride and quiet admiration. "You did it," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You proved them all wrong." Clara's eyes shone, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. She had done more than prove herself. She had proven that brilliance could exist anywhere, even in the places society had forgotten to look. "That's not just it, Dr. Hale," Clara replied softly. "I've done something for all the people who've been told they don't belong. I've opened a door for them." The world had changed that day, at least for Clara. She no longer felt the burden of being invisible, of being seen only for what others assumed about her. Now she was seen for who she truly was, a brilliant mind capable of changing the world. And that was the greatest victory of all. Clara stood outside the lecture hall, her heart still racing from the standing ovation she had just received. It had been an overwhelming experience, one she had dreamt about for years, but never truly believed she could achieve. Yet here she was, having shared her work with the world, no longer just a maid in the shadows, but a recognized voice in the field of astrophysics. The crowd had left, but Clara lingered, taking in the silence of the empty room. Her mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened, how her equations had been embraced, how her name had been spoken with respect, how she had stood at the front of the room as an equal among some of the brightest minds in science. For the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to feel proud. She wasn't just a cleaner. She wasn't just the woman who picked up after others. She was a woman who had fought for her place at the table, and in doing so had carved a space for others who would come after her. As she walked through the quiet halls of the university, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Evelyn. "I knew you could do it, baby. The world is just now seeing what we've always known about you. Keep shining." Clara smiled as she read the words, feeling the warmth of Evelyn's love and encouragement. The road ahead was still long, filled with challenges and obstacles, but she no longer feared them. She had faced the world's prejudices and had come out on the other side, stronger and more confident. The next morning, as Clara stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, getting ready for the day, she paused for a moment. The woman staring back at her was different than the one who had entered the institute all those years ago. She had shed the layers of invisibility, of self-doubt and of fear. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was Clara Johnson, an equal, a scholar. The journey had been long, but it had taught her a valuable lesson. No matter where you come from, no matter what people think you are, your mind can never be dismissed. Brilliance is not defined by your job title or your background. It's defined by the work you put in, the passion you carry, and the belief that what you have to offer is valuable. Clara's phone buzzed again, this time with an invitation. A prestigious university was offering her a position, a chance to join their faculty, to continue her research, to shape the future of science in ways she had once only dreamed of. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the next step in a journey that had only just begun. As Clara read the offer, she realized she was no longer afraid. The world had seen her, and now it was time for her to step into her future, not as someone who had to prove herself, but as someone who already had. She left her apartment, the weight of her notebook in her bag, and for the first time in years, walked with the knowledge that she had earned every step of the journey. The world was hers to change, and she was just getting started.